Mum, please, please call the police. He's coming. Oh God, help.
The line crackled, the voice breaking into sobs, then silence. The call lasted only 12 seconds, but it was enough to freeze the blood of anyone who heard it. A teenage girl, her words fractured by terror, begging for help into the void of a midnight phone line. That was the last trace of Rachel Miller. Her voice carried through static in the early hours of May 18th, 1996. After that night, she and three other teenagers simply disappeared. Their car gone, their lives erased, their town left with nothing but rumors, grief, and the echo of those final desperate words. And 2 decades later, when the FBI finally uncovered what had really happened, the truth was more disturbing than anyone had ever imagined. Before we dive into this mystery, if you're new here, make sure you hit subscribe, and in the comments below, let us know where in the world you're watching from. Your support helps us keep telling stories that the world has almost forgotten. Now, let's go back to the night of the East Ridge High Prom. Prom night 1996. East Ridge, a small Midwestern town wrapped in the illusion of safety, of innocence. The gymnasium of the local high school had been transformed into a glittering wonderland of lights and laughter. Streamers cascaded from the ceiling, the disco ball spun, and the floor throbbed with the rhythm of pop songs that everyone swore would define their generation. Amid the crowd were 4 teenagers who would never see the light of another day. Rachel Miller, 17, bright-eyed and ambitious, already accepted into a prestigious journalism program. That night, she wore a navy blue dress that shimmered under the lights. Beside her was David Holloway, her childhood friend. Tall, athletic, the pride of the school's basketball team. People said he had it all, but Rachel had noticed something about him that spring. An unease, a heaviness in his smile, as if he were carrying something he couldn't share. Then there was Amy Green, soft-spoken, shy, but beautiful in her simplicity. Her date was Mark Reynolds, the boy every girl in East Ridge seemed to know, with his easy charm and the tuxedo jacket slung over one shoulder like he was born to wear it. They weren't a tight-knit group, not really, but that night, fate had drawn them together. They shared a table, laughed at the same jokes, and made a decision that would haunt East Ridge forever, not to go home when the music ended. By midnight, the dance had thinned. Parents waited in idling cars. Teachers began pulling down decorations, balloons slowly sagging to the ground. But Rachel, David, Amy, and Mark weren't ready for the night to end. So they slipped out, climbing into David's Chevrolet Impala, an old car with a rusty frame that rattled on every turn. They pulled out of the school lot, headlights slicing through the cool spring air, and vanished into the night. What happened next has been stitched together from fragments, sightings, whispers, broken memories. Some swore they saw the Impala parked outside the Route 12 gas station, headlights glowing under the buzz of a flickering sign. Others insisted they passed the car on Old Mill Road, windows down, music spilling into the night. A third claimed they saw Rachel's navy dress near the edge of the woods, though no evidence ever supported it. And then there was the phone call. At 12:37 a.m., Rachel's mother's phone rang. She answered to her daughter's panicked voice, sobbing, begging her to call the police. The words were scrambled, broken, but her fear was unmistakable. Then silence. No follow-up call. No trace of where she was calling from. It was the last time anyone heard from any of them. By sunrise, East Ridge was stirring with unease. Parents called their children's friends, then the school, then the police. At first, authorities believed the group had run off, maybe chasing one last thrill before graduation. But when hours stretched into days, the town's worry curdled into dread. Search parties combed the woods, dogs sniffed along the edges of cornfields, and helicopters circled overhead. There was no trace of the Impala, no tire tracks leading into the forest, no shredded fabric caught on a fence. Not a single scream had pierced the quiet of that night. The 4 teenagers were gone, swallowed whole by the darkness. Rumors began to breed like shadows. Some whispered that Rachel, ever ambitious, had convinced the others to run away, to chase something bigger than their small town. Others spoke of a drifter spotted near Old Mill Road, a man with sunken eyes who vanished just as suddenly as the teens had. And then there were the older stories, stories about the woods outside East Ridge, about a place where strange lights flickered between the trees, where people had gone missing long before prom night. The kind of stories that parents told to scare their children, never believing they might carry a sliver of truth. The local sheriff was overwhelmed. Eventually, the FBI stepped in, bringing their resources, their cadaver dogs, their maps covered in red pins. But even with all their manpower, the search yielded nothing. The Impala had evaporated. And so had Rachel, David, Amy, and Mark. By the end of summer, the investigation slowed to a crawl. Rachel's parents left her bedroom untouched, the walls still plastered with posters of 90s bands, her desk stacked with unopened college brochures. David's younger brother wore his sneakers until the soles gave out, hoping one day he might hand them back. Amy's mother set an extra plate at Thanksgiving. Mark's father drove Route 12 at night, headlights scanning the road for a glimpse of his son. Years passed. Generations of students graduated. But for those who remembered 1996, there was always a scar, a night that ended in music and laughter, and in the morning gave nothing back but silence. The story might have remained buried forever, but in 2016, 20 years later, everything changed. A construction crew began clearing land near the expansion of Highway 34, just outside East Ridge. Bulldozers tore through dense brush that had been left untouched for decades. On a gray autumn morning, one of the workers spotted something half buried in the soil. At first, he thought it was scrap metal, but when they dug deeper, the truth surfaced. It wasn't old machinery, it was the rusted skeleton of a Chevrolet Impala. And inside, the FBI would uncover something that reopened the darkest chapter in East Ridge's history. The machines roared to a halt as dust rose into the air. The men on the crew stood frozen, staring at the corroded frame that was now jutting from the ground like a skeleton forcing its way out of the earth. They called the sheriff first, and within an hour, the area was sealed off with tape. When the FBI arrived, there was no mistaking it. The rusted heap had once been a Chevrolet Impala, the same car David Holloway had driven away in that night in 1996. For East Ridge, time itself seemed to rewind. Memories long buried were pulled from the shadows. Parents who had grown gray, classmates now raising their own children, all of them whispered the same question. Was this it? Had the missing finally been found? But the answer wasn't so simple. Inside the car, the investigators found bones, human bones. They were wedged beneath torn seats, tangled in rusted springs, scattered across the back floorboard. Time had reduced them to fragile fragments, but they carried the unmistakable weight of truth. 4 teenagers had gone into that car, but what the FBI unearthed didn't add up, because what they found inside the Impala was only 3 sets of remains. The news hit East Ridge like a thunderclap. For 20 years, everyone had assumed the 4 friends had shared the same fate. Yet here, in the cold certainty of bone and decay, was proof that one of them was missing still. The question became, who? DNA analysis began immediately. Weeks turned into months as specialists compared what little was left to surviving family members. The results, when they came, twisted the knife even deeper. The bones belonged to David Holloway, Amy Green, and Mark Reynolds. But Rachel Miller, the girl whose terrified voice had begged her mother to call the police, was nowhere to be found. The revelation sent the FBI spiraling back into the case with renewed intensity. Why had Rachel's remains not been in the car? Was she taken? Did she escape? Or was she somehow responsible for what happened that night? For Rachel's parents, the truth was unbearable. For 2 decades, they had grieved a daughter they believed dead. Now, there was a chance, however slim, that she might still be alive. But if she was, where had she been all these years? And why had she never come home? The Impala itself carried clues. The passenger side door was bent inward, as though it had been struck with massive force. The windshield was shattered from the inside out. The dashboard bore long, sharp scratches, too deliberate, too deep to be from simple impact. Even more chilling was what they found in the trunk. Inside lay a rotted backpack, its fabric stiff from time. Within it was a collection of notebooks, water-damaged and smeared with dirt. Most of the writing was illegible, but on one of the few surviving pages was a sentence scrawled in shaky ink. "He won't let us go home." No name, No explanation. Just that one haunting line. The case now reopened, consumed East Ridge once again. Reporters swarmed the small town. Old witnesses were tracked down and re-questioned. Neighbors whispered behind curtains, and buried secrets began to seep into the light. Because the more the FBI dug, the clearer it became. Rachel's phone call hadn't been the desperate cry of a girl who was simply lost. It had been the sound of someone being hunted. The investigation turned to the old stories, local legends about Old Mill Road, about lights in the woods, about people who vanished in the night. At first, the FBI dismissed them as folklore, nothing more than the imagination of a small town trying to explain the unexplainable. But then came the discovery that forced them to reconsider. Behind the clearing, where the Impala had been buried, was a path, overgrown, but still faintly visible. The agents followed it deep into the trees, their boots crunching on dead leaves. A mile in, they found it, the ruins of an old cabin, half collapsed, hidden beneath decades of moss and ivy. Inside, they found something that froze the blood in their veins. On the crumbling walls, faint but still legible, were carvings, names, and among them, scratched over and over again, was one word: Rachel. At this point, the FBI had no choice but to admit what East Ridge had feared for 20 years. Rachel Miller hadn't died with her friends. She had been taken. But by who? And worse, was she still alive? For Rachel's mother, the nightmares began again. She replayed that phone call endlessly in her mind, hearing her daughter's sobs, her plea for help. For David's brother, Amy's mother, Mark's father, grief transformed into something darker. Because if Rachel had lived, then the possibility lingered that she had seen what happened that night. That she might have answers, but Rachel never returned. And so the question that had haunted East Ridge for 2 decades only deepened. Who was Rachel Miller running from that night? And why had she never been found? The discovery of the Impala had reopened the case, but it had also created new horrors. And what the FBI found next would not only shake East Ridge, it would terrify the entire country. The discovery of the Impala and the remains of 3 teenagers had reignited East Ridge's darkest mystery, but it also forced the FBI to confront a chilling truth. Rachel Miller had not shared their fate that night. She had either escaped or been taken. The old cabin in the woods became their focus. Carvings of her name etched into the rotting wood, over and over again, hinted at something more than coincidence. But when forensic teams combed through the ruins, they found nothing else. No fingerprints, no fibers, no trace of who had been there. Just the silence of a place long abandoned, and a girl's name scratched deep into its bones. For the town, that was enough. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some said Rachel had been held there, trapped for days or weeks before she was finally silenced. Others whispered that the cabin was a shrine, carved by whoever had taken her, a reminder of the night he claimed his prize. But the truth, when it began to unravel, was even stranger. Investigators pulled the old case files from 1996, rereading every detail. That was when they noticed something odd, something overlooked at the time. Several witnesses had reported seeing another vehicle near the school that night, a dark pickup truck, parked just beyond the lot, its headlights briefly cutting across Old Mill Road. No one had thought much of it back then, dismissing it as a parent waiting for their kid. But when the files were cross-referenced 20 years later, the description matched another unsolved case. In 1995, a girl from a neighboring county had vanished walking home from a football game. Witnesses had reported a dark pickup near the scene. Her body was never found. Now, the FBI had 2 cases, one from 1995, another from 1996, and a vehicle tying them together. This wasn't random. Someone had been hunting. The media swarmed East Ridge. Every major outlet wanted the story. Former classmates were interviewed, parents were ambushed outside grocery stores, and old police officers were dragged out of retirement to answer questions they didn't want to revisit. But the most disturbing lead came from an unexpected place, a retired sheriff's deputy. He stepped forward saying there was something he had never been able to shake from that night. At 1:15 a.m., less than an hour after Rachel's frantic phone call, he claimed he had been patrolling near the county line when he spotted something strange. A man, tall, broad-shouldered, walking along the road in the dead of night. He was carrying something slung over his back, something small, something that looked like a girl. The deputy had slowed his car, but before he could stop, the figure slipped into the trees. When he pulled over and searched with his flashlight, the man was gone. At the time, he chalked it up to exhaustion. Maybe he'd imagined it. Maybe it was just a hunter carrying gear. But now, with the cabin discovered and Rachel's remains missing, the memory felt like more than coincidence. For Rachel's parents, the possibility was unbearable. Had their daughter been dragged into the woods that night, carried like prey into the darkness? Had she lived beyond that night, trapped somewhere no one had ever found? The FBI began expanding their search. They pulled missing persons reports from across the Midwest, looking for patterns. What they found sent chills down their spines. Between 1992 and 1998, at least 6 teenagers, mostly girls, but not all, had vanished within a 100-mile radius of East Ridge. Most had been last seen at night, often after big community events, games, dances, county fairs. And in 3 of those cases, a dark pickup truck had been reported nearby. This was no accident, no random tragedy. Someone had been hunting for years. As agents dug deeper, they made another discovery. Hidden within one of the notebooks recovered from the Impala's trunk, pages so water-damaged they had to be handled with tweezers, were faint words that, after enhancement, revealed a terrifying sentence. "Don't go near the man in the truck. Rachel says he watches us." The handwriting was shaky, rushed, as though written in the dark. It wasn't signed, but experts believed it belonged to Amy Green. If true, it meant Rachel had seen something, or someone, that night. And it meant that whatever happened wasn't sudden. It had been building, brewing. The 4 teenagers had been aware, at least in part, that something was stalking them. By now, the FBI was convinced Rachel Miller hadn't died with her friends. She had been taken, and the more they uncovered, the more it seemed she may have survived for longer than anyone wanted to imagine. The old cabin was tested for every forensic possibility. Soil samples, mold testing, even old nails were examined. That was when the lab found something chilling. In the dirt beneath one of the rotting floorboards, preserved by time and damp earth, was a single fingernail. Underneath it, traces of blue nail polish. Rachel had been wearing navy blue nail polish the night she disappeared. The evidence was clear. She had been there. And she had fought. The FBI's next move was to search deeper into the woods, tracing any old paths, hunting for other cabins or cellars long forgotten. But the woods around East Ridge were vast, miles of dense thickets and abandoned farmland. For every lead, there were a dozen dead ends. Still, the pattern was undeniable. A dark pickup, missing teens, an old cabin, and the haunting absence of Rachel Miller. The town of East Ridge, once quiet and unremarkable, now carried a different reputation. Parents warned their children not to walk alone at night. Old stories of the man in the woods resurfaced, whispered on playgrounds and in church basements. And while the community clung to hope, the FBI knew the truth. They weren't looking for a ghost story. They were looking for a predator. The discovery of the Impala had cracked open a door that East Ridge had kept shut for 20 years. And what spilled out was something darker than anyone had expected, because as investigators followed the trail, they stumbled onto something that suggested Rachel's story hadn't ended in 1996 at all. And when the FBI revealed what they found next, it wouldn't just terrify East Ridge, it would terrify the entire nation. The woods around East Ridge had always carried whispers. Parents warned their children never to wander too deep, not just because of coyotes or snakes, but because there were stories, tales of people who walked in and never walked back out. For years, those stories had been nothing more than folklore. But now, as the FBI scoured every inch of the forest beyond the buried Impala, the line between myth and reality began to blur. It was on the 4th day of their extended search that a discovery was made, one that chilled even the most seasoned investigators. Deep in a hollowed clearing, tucked behind walls of thorn and brush, they found a cellar door. Half-rotted, nearly consumed by moss and dirt, it would have been invisible to anyone not looking for it. When agents pried it open, the smell that escaped was enough to turn stomachs. Damp, mold, and something metallic, the lingering scent of blood long since dried. Inside, There was a small underground chamber. The walls were stone, the ceiling reinforced with decayed wooden beams. There was no furniture, only a rusted chain bolted into the wall, its end broken, hanging loose. And scratched into the stone, carved with something sharp, were words. Faint, uneven, but unmistakable. "I am still here." The FBI froze. Forensic teams moved carefully, documenting every inch of the chamber. Soil samples, DNA swabs, fiber analysis. It would take weeks to process, but the message was undeniable. Someone had been kept there. Someone had fought to leave a mark. And the handwriting, when compared to Rachel's high school notebooks, was a match. Rachel Miller had survived past prom night. The chamber became a crime scene unlike anything East Ridge had ever known. Reporters swarmed the area, their voices trembling as they spoke into cameras. Parents kept their children locked indoors. Hunters refused to enter the woods. Because if Rachel had been alive down there, chained like an animal, then someone in East Ridge had put her there. And maybe, just maybe, that someone was still out there. For Rachel's parents, the discovery was a twisted kind of hope, proof that their daughter had survived past that night, but also confirmation of their worst nightmare, that she had been taken, held against her will. Her mother replayed Rachel's last words in her mind again and again. "Mum, please call the police. He's coming." Now, for the first time, they understood who he was. Not some faceless threat, not some random accident. A man, flesh and blood, a predator who had haunted their town for decades. The FBI dug further into old records, cross-referencing every missing teenager within the surrounding counties. The pattern sharpened. County fairs, school dances, late-night football games, always public events, always noisy and distracting, always opportunities for someone to watch unnoticed. And then they uncovered something darker. Back in 1994, a girl named Emily Foster had gone missing after a church youth gathering 2 towns over. She was never found, but her diary, recovered from her room, carried a disturbing entry written just days before she vanished. "The man in the truck is watching again. He parks by the edge of the field. No one believes me." The description matched Rachel's friend Amy's, scribbled warning in the water-damaged notebook found in the Impala. "Rachel says he watches us." 2 girls, 2 towns, 2 years apart, both speaking of the same shadow. This wasn't a ghost story. This wasn't a coincidence. It was a man, a hunter. The FBI released no names to the public, but behind closed doors, their list of suspects grew. Old police reports were re-examined. Men who had lived near the woods in the mid-90s were quietly investigated. One by one, some were ruled out. Others weren't. But every time the agents thought they had a lead, it dissolved into nothing. The man in the truck was careful, patient, and above all, invisible. The seller, though, gave up one final piece of evidence. Beneath a layer of dirt and broken glass, an object was found wedged between the stones. A shoe, small, torn nearly in half, but still intact enough to identify. Rachel's shoe. Her parents confirmed it instantly. It was the pair she had worn that night, a navy blue heel, chosen because it matched her dress. Rachel hadn't just been taken. She had been dragged into those woods, and at some point, she had been chained underground, alive, desperate enough to carve a message into stone. But the shoe raised another horrifying question. If Rachel had been there, and if she had once fought against that chain, where had she gone? The case was no longer about what had happened in 1996. It was about what had happened after. Had Rachel managed to escape? Had she been moved from place to place, like a prisoner with no hope of freedom? Or was she still out there, alive but hidden, waiting for the day someone would finally find her? The FBI pressed forward, working under a terrifying assumption. If Rachel had survived for even a short time after prom night, then she may not have been the only one. What if the man in the truck had taken others? What if some of them were still out there? The people of East Ridge lived in fear once again. Locked doors, drawn curtains, children kept home from evening events. The woods, once a place for hiking and hunting, now felt like a graveyard of secrets, because the truth was clear. Rachel Miller had survived her prom night, and someone, somewhere, had made sure the world never saw her again. the investigation was far from over, because buried in the evidence files, hidden in plain sight for 20 years, was a clue no one had paid attention to. A clue that would connect Rachel Miller's disappearance to something far larger. And when the FBI uncovered it, the story of East Ridge would no longer be about 4 teenagers who vanished. It would be about a predator who had walked among them for years. The phrase echoed across every headline, "The man in the truck." It became a name spoken in whispers, a phantom painted in rumor. Parents told their children to stay away from old dirt roads. Teenagers dared each other to walk near the edge of the woods at night. Farmers swore they'd seen headlights where no road existed, and yet no one knew who he was. The FBI had their theories. They traced vehicle records from the 1990s, searching for pickups registered in the counties surrounding East Ridge. Hundreds of names surfaced, but one stood out, a man named Howard Pierce. Howard had once been a mechanic in town, quiet, lived alone, drove an old, rust-colored Chevy pickup that neighbors remembered seeing parked by the high school football field on Friday nights. He moved away in 1997, just months after the 4 teenagers disappeared. At first glance, Pierce fit the profile too perfectly. Isolated, odd, a man with no family ties and no alibi the night of prom. But when agents tracked him down in a faded trailer park 3 states over, they found a man hollowed by years of chain smoking and alcohol. His truck had long since been scrapped, and when questioned, his answers wavered between confusion and hostility. But strange didn't make him guilty. And just like that, the FBI's first solid lead collapsed. But then, a retired officer from a nearby county reached out with a memory. He remembered stopping a different truck late one night in 1995. A black Ford, its taillight cracked, parked near an abandoned service road not far from where Emily Foster disappeared. The driver? A man in his 40s, tall, clean-shaven, wearing a baseball cap pulled low. The officer couldn't recall his name, but one thing stuck with him. In the bed of the truck was a length of heavy chain. At the time, he thought nothing of it, but after hearing about Rachel's chain-scarred cellar, the detail clawed its way back to the surface. When the officer filed the stop back then, he listed it under routine patrol. The records still existed, and the driver's name was Charles Dwyer. Dwyer wasn't a stranger to East Ridge. He owned land just outside town, a sprawling property that bordered the very woods where Rachel's shoe had been found. He had worked as a contractor, often seen in town for odd jobs, but never staying long. On paper, he was unremarkable. Divorced twice, no children, faded into the background. But when the FBI dug deeper, unsettling details emerged. In 1994, he had been questioned, not arrested, but questioned after a young woman claimed he had followed her home from a grocery store late at night. The case went nowhere. In 1996, he suddenly put his property up for sale. By 1997, he was gone. To where? No one knew. His paper trail dissolved like smoke. Back in East Ridge, people began whispering his name. Old neighbors remembered the strange way he always kept to himself, the high fences, the locked sheds no one was allowed near. Some recalled hearing strange noises coming from his land at night, clanging metal, muffled screams, though at the time they brushed it off as imagination. Now, those memories haunted them. Was Charles Dwyer the man in the truck? Had Rachel's desperate call been the last sound she made before he dragged her into the woods? The FBI combed through every trace of Dwyer's past, credit cards, phone records, employment history. Slowly, a trail emerged, sporadic, faint, but undeniable. He had resurfaced in 2001 in Tennessee, working construction under a false name. In 2007, a traffic ticket placed him in Kentucky. By 2010, he was gone again, a ghost in the system. And then came the discovery that changed everything. When agents re-examined the Impala, specifically the trunk lining, they uncovered something overlooked during the first investigation 20 years earlier. A fiber, small, nearly invisible. But under modern analysis, it matched perfectly to the upholstery of a 1990s Ford truck. Not a Chevy, a Ford, the same truck Charles Dwyer was known to drive. The case against him grew stronger, yet still, no body, no definitive evidence tied him to the teenager's fate. But the FBI wasn't done. because tucked deep in the archived files of a missing persons case from another state was a photograph, a blurry, grainy image taken at a county fair in 1998. In the background of the photo, barely visible, was a man in a baseball cap. Beside him stood a girl, thin, pale, with long dark hair. And to Rachel Miller's mother, when shown the photograph, there was no doubt. She whispered her daughter's name, Rachel. The FBI scrambled to authenticate the image. Experts debated, was it really Rachel, or just a resemblance? The quality was too poor to confirm, but to Rachel's mother, the photo was proof. Proof that her daughter had lived beyond 1996. Proof that she had been seen, alive, in the company of the man who stole her life away. If that was true, then Rachel hadn't just been a victim of one night. She had been a prisoner for years. The thought alone was unbearable, and yet it opened the door to the most chilling possibility of all. If Charles Dwyer had kept Rachel alive for years, what had he done to her in that time? And more importantly, where was she now? The FBI doubled their efforts tracing every lead tied to Dwyer. They searched old addresses, interviewed past landlords, combed through abandoned properties. Every step brought them closer to the edge of a nightmare, because the deeper they dug, the clearer it became. The prom night disappearance wasn't an isolated tragedy. It was the work of a predator who had perfected his methods. And East Ridge was only one chapter in his story. That was when the FBI uncovered something hidden in plain sight, a storage unit, registered under a false name, paid in cash, still quietly maintained in a small town 2 hours away. When agents finally broke the lock and pulled open the heavy metal door, what they found inside turned the cold case into something far more sinister. Because inside that unit were boxes, dozens of them, each labeled with a year, and the earliest box was marked 1989. The storage unit sat in silence, its corrugated metal door groaning as agents rolled it up. Dust drifted into the late afternoon air. Inside was darkness, heavy and still. Rows of cardboard boxes filled the small space, stacked neatly, almost obsessively. Each box was labeled in thick black marker with a single year, 1989, 1990, 1991, all the way through to 1997. For a moment, no one moved. The air inside was different, thick with the smell of old paper, mildew, and something else, faint, metallic. The first box they opened was labeled 1989. Inside were Polaroids, dozens of them, rubber-banded in stacks, faces of girls, each one no older than 17, some smiling, some caught mid-blink, as if the photos had been taken without their knowledge. Notes were scrawled on the backs, names, dates, times, even locations. The photographs weren't family keepsakes, they were trophies. Another box revealed clippings from local newspapers. Each article highlighted a missing person, teenagers gone without explanation. Some cases had been solved, others remained open, but the pattern was unmistakable. Every single one was a girl. Every single one matched the same profile, young, vulnerable, easy to disappear. But it was the box marked 1996 that made seasoned agents turn pale. Inside was a sequined corsage, dried and brittle with age, a delicate necklace, broken at the clasp, and a navy blue shoe, its mate to the one found in the woods, Rachel's shoe. The evidence was undeniable now. Charles Dwyer wasn't just a suspect. He was the shadow behind the disappearances, the hunter who had stalked teenage girls across state lines for years. And the box confirmed something even worse. At the bottom was a cassette tape, labeled in neat handwriting, May 17, 1996. The night of the East Ridge prom. Agents transferred the tape to evidence and played it back in a secure room. At first, there was nothing but static. Then faintly, the sound of a car engine, laughter, music, muffled, like a radio playing from the front seat. Then, screams, high-pitched, panicked, a girl's voice breaking through the noise. Please don't, stop. The tape hissed, the sound of a struggle, a car door slamming, heavy footsteps. Then the unmistakable sound of chains clattering against stone. And finally, silence. Even hardened agents turned away, some leaving the room altogether. They had uncovered a predator's diary, a museum of stolen lives preserved in cardboard and ink. The FBI's focus shifted from what happened to where is he now, because Charles Dwyer had vanished nearly 2 decades earlier. If he was still alive, he would be in his 70s by now, old, but perhaps not finished. Predators like him rarely stopped. The possibility that he was still out there, still hunting, sent shockwaves through East Ridge and every county he had once passed through. Rachel's mother broke down when shown the evidence. She clutched the shoe like it was a piece of her daughter's soul, sobbing until her voice gave out. Her father sat in silence, his hands trembling, his jaw clenched, staring at the cassette tape as though he could burn it to ash by sheer will. For them, the boxes offered both closure and torment. Proof their daughter hadn't vanished by accident. Proof someone had taken her, held her, broken her life into fragments, and stored them like trophies. But also proof that she had suffered, that her final moments had been captured, preserved, replayed. And yet, the photo from 1998, the one Rachel's mother swore was her daughter, still hung in the air like a question mark. If Rachel had died in 1996, why had she been seen 2 years later? The boxes hinted at another truth, one even darker. Each year had its own collection of names, faces, and artifacts. But after 1997, there were no more boxes. Had Dwyer stopped? Had he vanished? Or had he simply moved his collection somewhere else? The FBI's answer came when they pulled one final item from the unit, tucked away at the very back. A map, folded, worn, marked with red X's. Each X was placed in a different state: Tennessee, Kentucky, W. And beside one X, written in neat black ink, were 3 words: still out there. The implication was terrifying. Dwyer hadn't stopped in 1997. He had kept moving, kept hunting, kept collecting. The boxes in the storage unit were only the beginning. The FBI launched a multi-state investigation, coordinating with local departments, pulling records, reopening cases long forgotten. The pattern was there, stretching like a shadow across decades. But for East Ridge, the nightmare remained personal, because in the end, one question mattered most. What had truly become of Rachel Miller? The cassette tape ended with silence, but when technicians enhanced the audio, boosting the faintest background sounds, they heard something new. A voice, low, calm, male. And just before the tape cut to static, he spoke 4 words that chilled every agent who heard them. She's not the last. The cassette tape's last words lingered in every agent's mind. She's not the last. It wasn't just a confession. It was a warning. If Charles Dwyer had spoken those words on prom night in 1996, then he had already planned for more victims. And the map found in the storage unit, the one dotted with red X's, suggested he had carried out that promise. The FBI pulled records from every state marked: Tennessee, Kentucky, West Virginia, Ohio, missing girls, cold cases, families who had never received answers. And as the data came together, a horrifying pattern emerged. Between 1996 and 2001, in each of those states, one girl had vanished every year. Same age range, same circumstances, no witnesses, no suspects. Just a shadow on the roadside, a truck in the dark. The deeper the FBI dug, the clearer it became. Dwyer hadn't been hiding. He had been moving, drifting from place to place, never staying long enough to be noticed, always finding the perfect opportunity. And then, in 2002, the disappearances stopped. For nearly 15 years, there were no new cases that fit the pattern. It was as if Dwyer had simply evaporated. But predators like him didn't just stop, not unless they were dead, or worse, unless they had found a way to continue without leaving a trace. It was in the hills of rural Kentucky where the FBI got their next break, an abandoned farmhouse purchased in 1999 under a false name. It had sat empty for years, crumbling, forgotten, until federal agents tore through it looking for answers. Inside, the walls were rotted, the roof sagging, but in the basement, they found something that stopped them cold. A hidden room. Like the cellar in East Ridge, it was underground, reinforced, the entrance concealed by a false wall. Chains still hung from the ceiling. A mattress lay rotting in the corner, stained beyond recognition, but carved into the plaster were words. Not just one message this time, but many, dozens of them, scratched until the walls looked like a canvas of despair. I want to go home. He won't let me out. Please, find me. And then one final carving, deep and jagged, as though made in desperation. R.M., Rachel Miller's initials. The FBI agents stared in silence. For years, people had speculated whether Rachel survived prom night. Now, there was no question. She had been here, alive, trapped, writing on the walls, hoping one day someone would see her cries. But that discovery came with a question more chilling than any before. If Rachel had been in Kentucky years after prom night, where had she gone next? For Rachel's family, the discovery was both a blessing and a curse. Her mother, upon seeing photographs of the carvings, whispered, "She was alive. She was alive for years." But the knowledge shattered her too, because if Rachel had been alive, then that meant she had suffered longer than anyone had ever imagined. Her father couldn't speak. He simply left the room, his silence heavier than words. The town of East Ridge, upon hearing the news, sank into fear all over again. Parents kept their children close. Old rumors flared like wildfire. Some swore they had seen Dwyer even recently, lurking on the edges of town. The man in the truck had become more than a figure of the past. He was a ghost that never let go. The FBI pressed harder, combing through land records, searching for more properties purchased under false names. One by one, a new trail emerged: empty farmhouses, storage sheds, abandoned cabins, each one carrying echoes of Rachel. And in one of those sites, agents found something that broke the case wide open. A journal, leather-bound, its pages yellowed, the ink faded but still legible. It wasn't written by Rachel, it was written by him. The handwriting was neat, meticulous. The first entry dated back to 1988. And as agents read through it, a sickening picture formed. Dwyer had documented everything: how he watched, how he chose, how he waited for the right night. But most chilling of all, he wrote about Rachel, again and again. "She fights harder than the others. Her eyes stay sharp even in the dark. She will be the one I remember." Page after page, the entries became more unhinged. "She dreams of home. I dream of her never leaving. The world forgets. I never will. She is still mine." The final entry, dated 2002, ended with a single line: "The fire is coming. Time to move on." No one knew what he meant, but one thing was certain: Rachel's story didn't end in that farmhouse. And the FBI wasn't chasing a cold case anymore. They were chasing a predator who had left behind a trail of scars across states, decades, and lives. Because if Dwyer had vanished in 2002, the real question was, where did he go? And had he taken Rachel with him? As agents flipped through the final pages of the journal, a slip of paper fell loose from the back cover. Folded, yellowed, nearly missed. On it was a single address: not in Kentucky, not in Ohio, but less than 50 miles from East Ridge. The slip of paper was small enough to be overlooked, creased, yellow, tucked into the back of the leather journal as if it had been meant to stay hidden. On it was an address written in Dwyer's neat, careful handwriting. Not another state, not another abandoned property hundreds of miles away. This one was close, too close, just 47 miles outside East Ridge. Agents wasted no time. At dawn, a caravan of black SUVs wound its way through back roads, the tires crunching gravel, engines humming low as mist curled across the hills. The address led them to a rural property at the edge of a pine forest, hidden down a narrow dirt track. The house was small, one story, faded paint peeling from the siding. The kind of place that looked abandoned at first glance, though the mailbox had been cleared recently. The grass, though high, was not wild enough to suggest decades of neglect. Someone had been here. They moved in carefully, weapons drawn, boots pressing softly against the earth. The front door was unlocked. Inside, the air was stale. Dust floated in thick beams of light through half-closed curtains. The living room was bare, except for a single wooden chair placed in the center of the floor, facing nothing. The silence pressed against the agent's ears. Then, in the corner, they saw it. A wall covered in photographs. The photos weren't hung like memories. They were arranged like an altar. Dozens of pictures, each one showing a girl. Some candid, taken from a distance. Others close up, faces half in shadow, as if the subject had been startled. But in the center of it all was Rachel, her prom portrait, smiling, wearing her navy dress, her eyes bright with the hope of a future that had never come. Beneath it was a Polaroid, far more chilling. Rachel, older, her hair longer, her face thinner, her eyes hollow, and on the back of the Polaroid, scrawled in Dwyer's hand, were the words, "Mine forever." The FBI knew then Rachel had lived for years after prom night. The photo, aged, worn, confirmed what her mother had believed when she saw that blurry county fair image. Rachel Miller had not died in 1996. She had been kept. The timeline, however, remained a mystery. How long had she survived? How many years had she been moved from cellar to cellar, locked behind hidden doors, her life reduced to a cruel ritual? And the bigger question, the one that made every agent's stomach twist, was whether she might still be alive even now. The search through the house uncovered more evidence. In a drawer, carefully organized, was a collection of cassette tapes, each one labeled with a date, some from the 1990s, others more recent. The FBI seized them all, but one tape in particular stood out. It was dated 2012, 10 years after Dwyer's journal had suggested he had moved on. When agents played the tape, the first sound they heard was a door creaking open. Heavy footsteps echoed on wood. Then came the faint sound of breathing, slow, labored, and then Rachel's voice, older now, but still carrying the same tremor of fear from her last phone call in 1996. "Please, I just want to go home." The room fell silent. Rachel had been alive in 2012, 16 years after prom night. The implication struck like lightning. If she had been alive then, could she still be alive now? The FBI had long believed they were chasing only memories, solving only a tragedy. But the tape proved this was no longer a story of the past. It was a story still unfolding. Every agent in the room knew it. Rachel Miller might still be out there, somewhere, and Charles Dwyer, if he was still alive, had her. The discovery ignited panic across East Ridge. Parents clutched their children tighter, unwilling to let them out of sight. Old rumors resurfaced, wild theories buzzing through diners, church steps, and grocery stores. Some swore they had seen a truck on the old service roads late at night. Others whispered that Dwyer had never left town at all, that he had been hiding in plain sight, watching them all these years. The fear wasn't just of the past anymore, it was of the present. Because if Rachel's voice was captured in 2012, that meant the man in the truck had never stopped. The FBI doubled down, spreading across counties, searching for any property tied to Dwyer or his aliases. But the more they uncovered, the more the puzzle twisted. Each property told part of the story, but never the end. Rachel had been there, and then she had been moved. Again and again, the trail was endless. And then came the detail that made agents' blood run cold. On the back of the Polaroid of Rachel, beneath the words "Mine forever," there was a second note, written smaller, almost hidden in the corner. It said, "She's waiting in the dark." The implication was unbearable. The dark wasn't just a metaphor. It was a place where Rachel might still be. And the FBI knew one thing with certainty. The nightmare of East Ridge wasn't buried in the past. It was still alive. The tape dated 2012 was more than evidence. It was a shockwave. Rachel's voice, fragile and broken, pleading after 16 years of captivity, shattered every assumption the FBI had carried. What had once been treated as a cold case was now something else entirely, an open wound. Rachel Miller had lived, and maybe, just maybe, she still lived. The team poured through property records once again, scouring for anything tied to Dwyer or his false identities past 2012. It was painstaking work, sifting through rental agreements, tax records, even utility bills paid in cash. Then, buried in an electricity statement from rural West Virginia, they found something, a cabin, registered under a dead man's name. Power bills paid sporadically, but consistently enough to suggest someone had been using it. The last payment, 2 years ago. The FBI mobilized immediately. The cabin sat deep in the Appalachian foothills, surrounded by thick trees, reachable only by a dirt road that wound up the ridge like a snake. The wood was weathered gray, the windows covered with plywood. To the outside world, it looked abandoned. But inside, the air was wrong. There were signs of life. A mattress, stained but recent, empty water jugs, cans of food stacked neatly in the corner, and on the far wall, chains bolted into the wood. Agents moved methodically, documenting every inch. There were no bodies, no living victims, but on the floor, scratched into the dirt with something sharp, were letters. R.M. Rachel had been here. Whether in 2012 or after, she had been kept inside this cabin. But she was gone now. The place was empty. One agent, searching through the debris, found a small metal box tucked beneath a loose floorboard. Inside were scraps of paper, each one scribbled with words in Rachel's handwriting. Day 4. I hear him above me. Day 19. I don't think anyone will find me. Day 31. Please tell Mom I tried. The notes stopped abruptly. No final goodbye, no ending, just silence. Rachel had been alive long enough to write, long enough to count the days, long enough to lose hope. But had she been moved again? Or had something worse happened? Forensic teams swept the cabin. They found a single hair caught in the chains. DNA confirmed it belonged to Rachel Miller. The discovery reignited the case in the media. News anchors spoke Rachel's name with hushed reverence, as if she were both a victim and a ghost haunting the living. Families of other missing girls begged the FBI to check if their daughters' names appeared in Dwyer's journal. Town after town, people whispered about headlights on lonely roads, about strangers who seemed to watch too long. The fear spread like wildfire, but the FBI had no choice but to keep chasing, because Rachel's story wasn't finished, and neither was Dwyer's. Weeks later, investigators traced another lead: security footage from a gas station only 20 miles from the West Virginia cabin. But tape was grainy, the quality poor, but the timestamp read 2013. On the screen, a tall man in a baseball cap filled a red gas can. He kept his head low, his shoulders hunched, and in the passenger seat of his truck, just barely visible through the reflection of the glass, was a woman. Thin, dark hair, pale, she never turned her head. But even in the blur of the footage, Rachel's mother swore it was her. The agents didn't dismiss it this time. Because the pattern was too strong, the timeline too precise. Rachel Miller wasn't just a girl who vanished on prom night. She had been living in the shadows for nearly 2 decades, pulled from place to place like a secret. The real question was, had she survived beyond 2013? If she had, then somewhere out there, Rachel Miller might still be alive. And if Charles Dwyer was still moving her from place to place, then he wasn't just a ghost from the past. He was a predator still hunting in the present. The FBI's hunt intensified, but with every lead they uncovered, the terror in East Ridge grew, because it wasn't just about Rachel anymore. It was about the message scratched into the tape from 1996. She's not the last. And in the last box recovered from the storage unit, beneath old photographs and faded notes, was a single envelope. Inside, written in Dwyer's steady hand, was a letter. It read, "The one you want is not gone. She is waiting. And when you finally find her, it will already be too late." The letter was undated. No one knew when it had been written, but its meaning was clear. Rachel's story wasn't over, and neither was his. The revelations from the West Virginia cabin sent ripples far beyond the FBI's evidence room. For the Miller family, it was both salvation and torment. On one hand, Rachel had been alive far longer than anyone had believed. On the other, the knowledge that she had lived in captivity, scribbling desperate notes in the dirt, chained to a wall, was unbearable. Her mother, Evelyn, clutched the Polaroid of Rachel as if it were scripture. "You see," she whispered in front of the cameras, "I told you she was alive. I told you. And now you tell me where she is." But the FBI had no answer. The people of East Ridge watched with wide eyes and locked doors. The town that had once whispered of ghosts and shadows now knew the shadows were real. Every missing poster that had faded on telephone poles was remembered. Every rumor about headlights in the woods resurfaced, and every parent began to wonder, If Dwyer had taken Rachel, who else had he taken? Former investigators who had worked the case in the 90s came forward. One retired detective admitted he had always felt they were missing something obvious, that Rachel's case wasn't just about prom night, but part of a larger design. Another officer revealed that back then, several young women in surrounding counties had vanished under circumstances eerily similar, though their names were quickly forgotten, overshadowed by Rachel and her friends. Suddenly, the narrative twisted. Maybe Rachel wasn't Dwyer's only victim. Maybe she was just the one who left behind a trail strong enough to follow. The FBI's behavioral analysts dug into Dwyer's psyche. Charles Dwyer hadn't been a random predator. His obsession was systematic. He studied his victims. He watched them. He waited until their lives reached moments of beauty or hope. Nights like prom, moments of triumph or fragile happiness. And then he stole them away. It wasn't about killing. It was about possession. One analyst described him in chilling terms. Dwyer wasn't hunting for bodies. He was hunting for souls he could cage. Rachel wasn't his victim. She was his collection. This new understanding painted the discoveries in an even darker light. The chair in the abandoned house wasn't just furniture. It was a throne for him to sit and watch. The chains in the cabin weren't restraints. They were symbols of ownership. And the photographs, hundreds of them, were his gallery. Dwyer didn't just take lives, he curated them. In the middle of this storm, the FBI released one haunting clip from the cassette tapes to the public. Rachel's voice, older, frailer. "Please, I just want to go home." The nation froze. For many, it was the first time they had heard Rachel Miller, not as a name in a headline, but as a living, breathing human being, crying out from the shadows. It was a moment no one could ignore. And if you're watching this right now, pause for a second. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss what comes next. Because what happens after this tape is revealed is more terrifying than anything before. Like this video and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. In the wake of that tape, tips flooded in. People claimed they had seen Rachel. Others swore Dwyer had been spotted at diners, rest stops, even church parking lots. Most of these leads went nowhere, but one stood out. A woman from Kentucky reported that in 2015, she had seen a man in a baseball cap at a roadside motel. With him was a thin, pale woman who never looked up, never spoke, and wore long sleeves despite the heat. The FBI checked the motel's records. The man had checked in under yet another false name. But the handwriting on the registration card? It matched Dwyer's. The past was no longer distant. A nightmare wasn't buried in 1996. It had walked into 2015, and the FBI realized they weren't chasing history anymore. They were chasing a man who might still be out there, and a woman who might still be alive. The motel lead from Kentucky gnawed at the FBI like a splinter. If the witness was telling the truth, then Charles Dwyer had been alive and active nearly 20 years after prom night. And more terrifying still, Rachel might have been with him. The handwriting analysis confirmed it. The scrawl on the motel registration card matched Dwyer's old employment forms, down to the peculiar curve of his R. Dwyer was still moving, still hiding, still collecting. Agents swept through the motel room where he had stayed. Years had passed since that night, but faint traces remained. Forensic teams uncovered long strands of dark hair caught in the drain. DNA confirmed what they dreaded. It belonged to Rachel Miller. The trail was alive. From there, investigators traced credit card activity, gas station footage, and phone pings tied to burner devices. Each step led them deeper into Appalachia, through a maze of abandoned mines, forest cabins, and hunting lodges. And at every stop, they found whispers of Rachel. A carved RM on the wall of a storage shed. A silver locket left beneath a cabin floorboard. A note, water damaged but still legible, that read, "Don't forget me. Please don't forget me." The evidence piled higher, but so did the questions. If Rachel had survived until at least 2015, then where was she now? And why had Dwyer allowed traces of her to remain? One profiler suggested something chilling. Dwyer's arrogance has grown. He wants us to find these pieces. He wants to show us his power. Every clue is his way of saying, "I'm still ahead of you." In East Ridge, fear turned to obsession. Amateur sleuths combed old maps, searching for forgotten bunkers and storm cellars. Parents warned their daughters not to walk alone after dark. And on online forums, people whispered that Dwyer wasn't just one man anymore. He was a legend, a curse that would never die. But the FBI didn't have the luxury of superstition. They had proof, and proof demanded action. Then, in 2019, a missing persons case broke open a terrifying possibility. A 19-year-old girl named Ashley Porter vanished on her way home from a college party in Tennessee. Her car was found abandoned on a rural highway. No signs of a struggle, no trace of her body. At first, it looked like any other disappearance, but in her diary, investigators found a note. Ashley had written that she felt she was being watched, that a man in a truck had followed her for weeks, and her final entry, written the night before she vanished, read, "He told me she wasn't the last." The FBI froze. Those words echoed the original tape from 1996, the same phrase that had haunted them for decades. She's not the last. Now, 23 years later, another girl was gone. The parallels were undeniable. And if Ashley's abduction was connected, then it meant one thing: Charles Dwyer hadn't stopped. He had started again. The Bureau shifted focus, widening the manhunt beyond Rachel. This wasn't just about one girl anymore. It was about a predator who had resurfaced, perhaps emboldened, perhaps fueled by the very myths surrounding him. And the deeper they dug, the more they began to see a chilling pattern. Every few years, Dwyer resurfaced in a different state: a motel, a cabin, a rest stop, always leaving behind just enough evidence to suggest Rachel was still alive. But now, with Ashley gone, it seemed the cycle had begun anew. What terrified the FBI most wasn't just the disappearances, it was the possibility that Rachel herself had become part of the cycle. Had she survived long enough to witness another girl's abduction? Had she tried to warn Ashley? Or worse, had she been forced to help Dwyer lure her in? The thought was unbearable. But in the dark corners of evidence boards, pinned beside photographs and maps, that possibility lingered like a poison. By late 2019, agents had a new target: a series of underground bunkers rumored to exist in a remote stretch of Tennessee forest, built decades earlier by survivalists. Locals claimed hunters had seen movement there. Strange lights at night, a truck parked where no truck should be. It was enough for the FBI to act. They prepared for a raid. Armed teams, dogs, floodlights, the works. But what they found inside those bunkers was not what anyone expected. There were no bodies, no captives, but on the walls, spray-painted in thick black paint, were words that froze every agent in their tracks. "You're too late." And beneath it, a single Polaroid pinned to the concrete. Rachel, older, gaunt, eyes wide with terror. Dated 2019, Rachel Miller was still alive, and the FBI knew, without a shadow of doubt, that Charles Dwyer was watching them, laughing at them, daring them to catch him. The Polaroid dated 2019 left the FBI shaken. Rachel Miller was alive, older now, worn thin by decades in the shadows, but undeniably alive. The photo was both proof of life and a taunt. Charles Dwyer was still out there, and he wanted them to know he was untouchable. But for the first time in years, the agents had something tangible. The handwriting on the back of the Polaroid carried a faint smudge of ink. Under analysis, it matched a brand of marker sold only in a handful of stores across Tennessee, and from there, the hunt tightened. Late one October night, under the cover of fog, the FBI descended on a rural property outside Knoxville. It wasn't a cabin this time. It was an old storm shelter buried beneath a collapsed barn, nearly invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. The dogs barked wildly as agents forced the hatch open. The hinges screamed, and a gust of stale air rushed out like the breath of a tomb. Flashlights swept across narrow stairs, descending into blackness. And what they found below was unlike anything before. The shelter was divided into rooms, small concrete cells. Each one contained remnants of a life that had been held captive. A hairbrush, a faded prom corsage, torn scraps of clothing. But in the final room, chained to the wall, was something that made every agent stop cold. A blanket, fresh, a plate of food, half-eaten, and a single shoe, Rachel's shoe, still warm. The silence in that room was deafening. Rachel had been there. Not days ago, not weeks, hours. And then it happened. As the agents fanned out, one of them called for silence. Everyone froze, ears straining in the dark. From somewhere deeper in the shelter, faint at first, but unmistakable, came the sound of movement, chains rattling, and then a voice, weak, trembling, barely a whisper. "Help, please, someone." The agents surged forward, hearts pounding, lights cutting through the dark. The sound grew clearer, echoing against the walls. It was a woman's voice, older, ragged, but still carrying that same desperate tremor they had first heard on a phone call in 1996. Rachel Miller. They reached the final door at the back of the shelter, heavy, reinforced steel, the kind no ordinary person could open from the inside. The voice was clearer now, pressed right against the metal. "Please, don't leave me again." An agent shouted her name. "Rachel, we're here. We're going to get you out." But before they could break through, the sound of an engine roared above them. Tires squealed. Gravel spat against the barn floor. The truck. By the time agents scrambled up the stairs, the headlights were already disappearing into the misty night. Charles Dwyer had been there, watching, waiting, and he had left them with one last haunting choice. Rachel's voice still echoed below the earth. The truck roared away into the dark, and the FBI knew, no matter what they did next, they were already too late. And if you've made it this far, don't forget to hit subscribe so you don't miss part 2 of this investigation. Share this video with a friend who loves mysteries, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Because this story is far from over. Because as the agents stood frozen between Rachel's cries and Dwyer's fading engine, they realized something chilling. This was never just about saving one girl. It was about stopping a man who had built his life around a single promise. She's not the